This has been a really strange year, hasn't it? It has certainly been for us. There's been so many unprecedented and unpredictable things going on in our society. People are really scratching their heads about what's going on. And, the Bible talks about how Jesus is coming back one day and there'll be signs of the times and so forth. It has a lot of people wondering, man, are we living in those final days? Are we seeing the end of history as we know it begin to come to an end? Well, maybe that's what some of you are thinking as we begin our series today on the book of Revelation. But I got to tell you that a lot of people have been trying to connect the dots between the book of Revelation and current events, historical events, for a long time, and honestly, they've all failed. For example, Charles Taylor in 1976 predicted when he thought Jesus would return. Well, between then and 1994, he had to revise his guesstimate 12 different times. In the late 1970s, Pat Robertson on the 700 Club broadcast said he thought that the end of the world would come by the fall of 1982. And then Jack Van Impe in 2001, he predicted that 2001, that we'd see such an unprecedented array of international events and calamities that it had to be the end. But somehow that didn't really happen. Maybe he was thinking of 2020 instead. In 1999, Jerry Falwell told a large group at a conference that he was certain that Jesus would come back again within the next 10 years. Well, that was 20 years ago. And I could go on and on with more illustrations along those lines. So as we start this series on the book of Revelation, I think maybe what we start to realize is that it probably wasn't intended by God to give us a timeline of future events. And so that's not the approach that we're going to take. Well, that raises the question, then why do we study the book of Revelation? What I want to do today as we look at chapter 1 and give you an introduction to this, I want to show you the great value that the book of Revelation has to us that's far more valuable than trying to speculate about the times that we live in and the things that are happening in world history around us. And we're going to really see as we're going to take a look at the approach that we're going to take. We're going to examine some of the basic ideas and themes of the book of Revelation to set you up for this. And we're going to see then the great value that it has for our lives. And so if I was to ask maybe 100 Christians, maybe 1,000 Christians, whatever, what is the book of Revelation really all about? The majority of them would probably say it's really about predicting the future. And some of them might say, well, it's really about the return of Jesus. And while Revelation does have both of those elements involved in it, you think about it, the return of Jesus doesn't even show up until chapter 19 of 22 chapters. And so I want to think about some maybe bigger picture. And so for me, if you ask me what is the book of Revelation all about, I would say that the book of Revelation is all about Jesus. And not just his return, but a much bigger picture of who Jesus is. And so use this analogy. If the book of Revelation was a movie, Jesus is the blockbuster star of the show. And all the other nations and the characters and figures that come across the screen, they're just bit players. They're secondary players. And you might look to try to find yourself in the book of Revelation and to find your own times and your own issues. And that's not impossible to do. We're going to see why later. But when it comes down to it, really, you're nothing more than an extra among maybe hundreds of thousands of extras on the scene. The book of the Revelation is really all about Jesus, and that's the most important thing to remember about it. And so we see that as we look at the first couple of verses in Revelation chapter 1. Let's take a look. Revelation 1 verse 1 says, "This is a revelation from Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants the events that must soon take place. He sent an angel to present this revelation to his servant John, who faithfully reported everything he saw. This is his report of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ." So you see, right in verse 1, it says, this is a revelation from Jesus Christ. And that phrase also could mean it's a revelation of Jesus Christ. And so that really sets up for us how we're going to look at this book. We're going to focus on some scenes that describe who Jesus is. We're not going to really try to look at every chapter of the book of Revelation. We're not going to try to figure out every symbol and what every symbol means. We're not going to try to create a timeline of Revelation. We're going to focus on a few chapters that really highlight the person of Jesus and what he's all about. And so as we get into it, you see, we're going to see down in verse 4 that this is written for an audience of 7 churches, 7 ancient churches. And we actually talked about that a couple of years ago, and you can find that information about that at pursuegod.org. But it says that this is written to show his servants the events that must soon take place. And so from their point of view, this was not necessarily the distant future, but at least there was some element of it that was soon coming future for them. And with that in mind, that helps us to understand that there's 4 lenses that we need to read and look at the book of Revelation through. There is, first of all, the lens of the original first century audience. And there's some things in the book of Revelation that really only make the most sense when you look at them in light of the events that were happening there at the time that it was first written from the perspective of those original readers. And so these are events that were about to happen for them, but for us they might be in the distant past. The second lens is, we call it the future lens, and there are things in the book of Revelation that for sure that only make sense in light of the times and the events that are immediately preceding and surrounding the return of Jesus at some time in the future. And then there's the third lens, we call that the universal lens. And what this means is that the book of Revelation pulls back the curtain and shows us what's going on in the unseen realm, this cosmic conflict between God and Jesus and his followers on one hand versus Satan and the forces of evil on the other hand, whatever shape they might take. And this cosmic conflict has been going on from day one for Christians. And so it's not just related to one particular time frame of the past or the future. And then related to that, then we can talk about the contemporary lens. So we want to look at it, at Revelation, through the perspective of how this great universal cosmic conflict and the identity of Jesus and the forces of evil, how all of that plays into our own personal issues and choices that we're making day in and day out. But the simplest thing to remember is if you read that this in light of the fact that it's all about Jesus, then that's really going to help you to be able to understand what it's saying in our time and in our place. It's all about Jesus. So now the second thing as we approach this into the next verses that I want you to understand to give you this overview is that the book of Revelation is meant for faith and obedience, not for speculation. Now, a lot of people want to read the book of Revelation like it's the National Enquirer, right? Inquiring minds want to know. And the more offbeat and out there and strange that the story is, the more interested we are in it. And so some people read the book of Revelation and say, man, I want to know who the Antichrist is. Or I'm curious about what the role of America is in the future. Or I want to understand all of these cryptic symbols that I see in the book of Revelation. But you know, the book was not written for speculation. And in fact, the book itself in these first verses tells us what our response to it ought to be. Look at verse 3 in chapter 1. He said, God blesses the one who reads the words of this prophecy to the church, and he blesses all who listen to its message and obey what it says, for the time is near. Now, a couple things there. He says that this is a book of prophecy. And I want you to understand that prophecy, we often think about that as being something that's just about the future. And of course, it does include the future in the Bible. But prophecy is not mainly about that. Prophecy in the Bible is mainly designed to help God's people to remain faithful to him. And so sometimes it gives us a glimpse of the future for that purpose. And so really what this book is about is that God's people in the first century and ever since then are facing some challenges, facing tough times. And God says, I'm going to pull back the curtain and give you this bigger view of things so that knowing how things really work behind the scenes, then that will help you to remain faithful to me. Now, it also, we saw in verse 1, we saw that this is also called a revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, this is a kind of a technical word. It means a certain thing. It's literally, the word is an apocalypse of Jesus Christ. And that word in the ancient language simply means an unveiling, a revelation of Jesus Christ. But that word lent itself to a whole genre of literature that was common in that time frame called apocalyptic literature. And that is found in the Bible, in the book of Revelation, in parts of the book of Daniel, The book of Zechariah in the Old Testament is probably the classic example of apocalyptic literature. And it's its own genre, it's its own style of writing, and so we have to read it for what it is. We can't just read it as if it were history. It's not history. It's not a simple letter like the epistles of Paul. And so for apocalyptic literature, a couple features of it. Number one is it often features dreams and visions, these dream sequences. Another thing is that it's full of symbolism that for us 2,000 years later is maybe often very hard to understand. Symbols that might be easy for us to understand in our culture might be really hard for someone to understand 2,000 years from now. And the same thing as we look back at the book of Revelation. And the third thing about apocalyptic literature is that it's not necessarily chronological in its timeline. And so you don't read Revelation as if it's history like the book of Exodus or the book of Acts. You see themes occurring over and over again, so it has this cyclical sense to it as well. And so a lot of people make the mistake of trying to read Revelation like it's a blueprint, when really the best way to look at it is as if you're viewing an abstract painting. And for that reason, the book of Revelation is hard to read. And a lot of people shy away from it as a result. But what we see here in verse 3 is that God gives a particular unique blessing to people who don't shy away from the book of Revelation. He says, number one, that there's a blessing for those who will read it. And the blessing comes, I think a lot of it, is because when we read it, we see this exalted, glorious picture of Jesus, and it increases our faith as we find out who Jesus really is and his role in human history. But he also says there's a blessing for those who heed it and who listen to it. That means to heed it, to pay attention, to really carefully listen to what it's saying. And then finally he says there's a blessing attached to those people who obey it. That's how we understand the meaning of Revelation. It's not for speculation, it's for obedience. In fact, this is so important that we see it not only at the beginning of the book of Revelation here, but we also see it at the very end. In the last chapter, in chapter 22, Jesus says, "Look, I'm coming soon. Blessed are those who obey the words of prophecy written in this book." So see, when you see something at the beginning and the end, that's a pretty good idea that it's important. Jesus says, "I'm coming soon. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to map out the timeline." No, he says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to live in obedience to the things that you learn in this book. That's really what it's about, not speculation, but to change and transform our hearts and our lives. Now, with that in mind, let's get back to the main theme again, the theme of Jesus. And so in chapter 1, it takes us into a deeper dive on who Jesus is. And I want you to see that the book of Revelation presents Jesus as you have never seen him before. So John's going to take us to a picture of Jesus that is not like the Jesus that we see when he walked on the streets of Jerusalem, but he again pulls back the curtain to show us the current reality of things in the unseen world, and we see this amazing picture of Jesus. Let's take a look in verses 4 and 5. He says, "This letter is from John to the 7 churches in the province of Asia. Grace and peace to you from the one who is, who always was, and who is still to come, from the sevenfold Spirit before the throne, and from Jesus Christ. He's the faithful witness to these things, the first to rise from the dead, the ruler of all the kings of the world. All glory to him who loves us and has freed us from our sins by shedding his blood for us." So as John opens the letter, he starts with the Trinity. He says, hey, grace and peace to you from, first of all, God the Father who always existed. Secondly, from the Holy Spirit. And then he breaks the pattern, because usually the Bible talks about Father, Son, and Spirit. This time he talks about Father, Spirit, and then Son, because he wants to emphasize what we see about Jesus here. We see things, he's the faithful witness. In other words, what he tells us is true, that he's the first to rise from the dead. That implies that there's many more who will follow after him. That he's the king of the ruler of the kings of the world. That's just to help people who are going through tough times to realize who's really in control. And then it gets personal here. He says he loves us and he's freed us from sin by shedding his blood. And so all glory is what he deserves. And then John goes even deeper into it, because a few verses later, he has this amazing vision, this picture of Jesus as he's exalted. And as we look at that picture, it's so dramatic. I don't want to focus on the details. I want the whole overall impact of it to soak in on you as we take a look. down in verse 12, John says, I turned to see who was speaking to me. I saw 7 gold lampstands, and standing in the middle of the lampstands was someone like the Son of Man. He was wearing a long robe with a gold sash across his chest. His head and his hair were white like wool, as white as snow. His eyes were like flames of fire. His feet were like polished bronze refined in a furnace. His voice thundered like the mighty ocean waves. He held 7 stars in his right hand, and a sharp 2-edged sword came from his mouth, and his face was like the sun in its brilliance. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as if I were dead. But he laid his right hand on me and said, Don't be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I died, but look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and the grave. So John was so impressed by this amazing vision of Jesus that he fell down on his feet as if he were dead. And so I wonder, as you look at this picture, how does it impress you? What is your heart's response to this amazing picture of the exalted Jesus? And I just want to touch on a couple things here about this. First of all, think about when Jesus came the first time, he came in humility. He was born in a manger. He lived in a family of no account, with no means and no riches. And he wasn't born as a king, but as a carpenter. He didn't even have any status in the religious establishment of the day. He didn't own anything. And then eventually he died and was tortured in a brutal way, in a criminal's death. And because of all these factors, a lot of people didn't really see him for who he really was, didn't recognize him. But now we see him as he really is. We see him exalted into the glorious splendor that he had before he came into our world. And this is the picture of Jesus that the book of Revelation presents to us. It gives us plenty to feed our hearts in worship and gratitude and amazement, adoration toward him. 3 things I want to focus on. First of all, you see, he says, I'm the first and the last. Now, when Jesus said that, that's quite surprising. It's quite amazing because what he did was he used a title that God used for himself 3 times in the book of Isaiah. So look at, for example, in Isaiah chapter 42, God says, Listen to me, O family of Jacob, Israel, my chosen one. I alone am God, the first and the last. So Jesus takes that title and applies it to himself. Wow, that's incredibly significant. And then he says, I'm the one who is alive from the dead. After Jesus died on the cross, he rose again from death on the 3rd day. And he says, I'm the one who now lives and I'm alive forevermore. He's encouraging us that those who follow him are going to also have life. And he's the source of life for all of us. And then he says, I hold the keys to death and the grave. So death is not ultimate. The grave is not more powerful than Jesus. And that's good news. See, these are not just random abstract statements about Jesus, but each one of these statements we're going to see has important significance as the whole book of Revelation plays out before us. And so, with that in mind, then there's one other thing I want to share from you, not here from chapter 1, but it gives us a bigger picture of what the whole book of Revelation is. And we're going to see as we go into this book that the book of Revelation offers hope that Jesus will prevail over all evil. So let's take a minute and look at it from the perspective of the first readers of this book, the people in the first century. They had just been going through some persecution. In fact, John was in exile when he wrote this because of his faith. But there was a bigger persecution right around the corner that was about to happen. And this was associated with the practice in the Roman Empire that was ascending the idea of emperor worship. So emperor worship was coming into play, and the one who brought it to its highest apex was the Emperor Domitian, who was ruling right around the time that this was written, in the last decade of the first century. So Domitian set into practice a policy that to be loyal to the emperor and to the empire, every citizen was required to declare, Caesar is Lord. Now, Christians couldn't declare that. You understand why? Because Christians declare that Jesus is Lord. But they had to say Caesar is Lord. And there were great public celebrations and pageants that were associated with the emperor worship. And Christians, they were part of the fabric of the community, and Christians were pressured to participate in those events. It would be like if there was a great big 4th of July celebration and you go down, there's big fireworks and a parade and all the stuff. And then at the end of that, they say, hey, and now we're going to offer incense in honor and reverence to our president. And Christians say, wait a minute, we don't worship a human being. And if you didn't do it, you'd be considered to be unpatriotic and maybe even to be a traitor to America. Well, that's the bind that Christians were in the Roman Empire. So they were economically marginalized. They were socially outcast because of that. And even more than that, sometimes they were subject to punishment and even death. And so when it talks about Jesus this way, this is not just a mere abstract ideas or some random thoughts, but these are designed when it talks about Jesus being the first and the last and the living one and the one who holds the keys and the ruler of all the earth, that these are to encourage Christians who are facing a tough time to remember where things really stand, to remember that they can be faithful, that they have reason to not compromise and to hang in there and not give in to the powers that oppose them and to oppose Jesus Christ. And so let me show you just one verse that's a great capsule summary of the whole book of Revelation, just as we begin here today. It's Revelation 17, verse 14. It says, together they will go to war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will defeat them because he is Lord of all lords and King of all kings, and his called and chosen and faithful ones will be with him. And so this shows us three things. It shows us the cosmic battle that we talked about between powers of evil against God and his powers. And so that helps us to understand the nature of that, whether it's going to be an emperor or dictator, whether it's just the force of culture against us, or whether it's the demonic powers that are unseen behind all that. But it also shows us the victory of Jesus the Lamb, that he conquers. He's going to defeat all them. Why? Because of who he is. Because he's Lord of all lords, King of all kings. There's no Caesar. There's no Stalin, there's no Ayatollah who can stand against Jesus as King of the world. That's hope for us. And then the last thing, the third thing is really awesome, because here it gets personal again. And it says, his called and chosen and faithful ones will be with him. So we get swept up in the victory along with Jesus if you belong to him. And so yes, the movie's not about us. Jesus is the star. You know, we're the bit players. We don't get a credit maybe in the credits, but we all get to share in the Oscar together. And so I don't know what you might be facing. I know that in our lives we face all kinds of forces of evil in our lives. And so I don't know what you're struggling with today, but I want to encourage you that the book of Revelation is about hope. We have reason for hope. Yes, the forces of evil seem to be arrayed against us in different ways. Maybe as a whole Christian church, we're suffering from policies or from attitudes in our society. Or maybe you've personally been mocked or ridiculed because of your faith and how you practice your faith. Or maybe on a more private note, you're wrestling with the forces of evil and trying to live a Christian life, and you feel hopeless and defeated against the powers of temptation and addiction and sin, whatever it might be. And so maybe sometimes you feel like just giving up on the fight. Well, that's when you need to know who Jesus is, as he's revealed to us here, that he is the ultimate answer, that Jesus is in control, that Jesus wins in the end, and that there's no power in heaven or earth that can ever diminish him. And whatever happens, nothing can separate us from him. And that's the hope that we have in the book of Revelation. And so, you know, as we conclude, I just want to encourage you, here's a takeaway, is I want to encourage you to read the book of Revelation at least once this summer during this series. Read it at least once, because there's a blessing attached to those who read it. And then even beyond that, I'd encourage you to read it once a week. And that'd be about a 10-minute commitment every day. You could read the book of Revelation once a week through this whole series. The longer that you read it, the more you read it, you start to really see things start coming together and falling into place, especially as we're talking about it on Sundays. And so I want to encourage you to read it. And as you read it, I pray that your heart and your mind would be open to seeing Jesus, and maybe seeing Jesus in a whole new way. As you see him exalted, as you see what he's really like, and the veil is pulled aside and we can see what's really going on in the heavenly realms and the unseen realms, I pray that you would become encouraged and hopeful as you read about him. And I pray that your heart would be moved to worship and you'd be moved to kneel before him in adoration as you read about him. And I pray that as you encounter Jesus the King, that you'd be led to surrender to him, to surrender your life and your ways to him, because as you read, this is intended for us to obey and to have our lives transformed.